Okay, well, I think we're ready to get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this Cision webinar on understanding your audiences. My name is Scott Newton, and I'm a Senior Director here in our Strategic Operations team at Cision. I work to bring new and innovative services to life for our clients, and have recently been focused on a project to really enhance our offering for customers who are seeking to better understand their industry landscape and the key audiences that they need to speak to. I'm also pleased to be joined today, shielding from the heat in an air-conditioned office, by Megan.
Hello everyone, I'm Megan. I'm our Insights Director for our retail and FMCG clients. I will be sharing with you some examples, specifically from that sector and a bit wider as well, which I hope you'll find really useful today.
So today, as we said, we're going to guide you through both some theory and also some practice, aiming to demonstrate how your communications team can better listen to audience trends, craft specific campaigns, and meet audiences where they are to continually measure and refine your approach in order to achieve maximum impact. As we proceed through our presentation, do feel free to drop questions into the chat. I know we've already had some from the sign up. We'll obviously come to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And of course, any that we don't get to, we'll happily follow up on afterwards. But let's maybe make a start by considering the challenges that the modern communicator faces when trying to identify and research and reach key audiences in this modern media landscape. Now, I've been working in the industry for probably about 10 years, and I would say that there's probably two truisms that have run throughout that time. And that's really that we're living in an age of both exploding choice and also eroding trust. So across that 10 years, there's been a dramatic reduction in some forms of what you might term as communal consumption of media. So there's an 85% drop in 10 years in terms of the total number of UK TV episodes that have 10 million live viewers. So that's a huge drop in a really communal form of media experience. We've also really had a dip in terms of, as we all know, the sort of combined national print newspaper readership. It's fallen by about half, and obviously what remains is mostly now free sheets, and indeed many titles have actually started to remove themselves from the ABC sort of public measurement of readership process altogether. And of course, that hasn't changed in the last few years. There are also further changes. And we know that over the course of the last few years now, for the first time, social media has been identified as the leading and the main source of news for people between 18 and 24 years old. So it's actually now overtaken the use of online websites. Thanks to a really sort of quite startling growth over the course of even just the last 6 or 7 years. Now, you see, that obviously leads to a much more personalized mix of media than we've ever had before, but it also leads to, we've also noticed that, a real increase in how discerning audiences are about the content that they're consuming. So this bottom data here is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. And it's the percentage of people who worry that they may be purposefully misled by journalists, by politicians, and by business leaders as well. Indeed, we've seen a sort of increasing trend that what the Reuters Institute described recently as selective avoidance, where consumers are increasingly making an active decision to unplug from the news cycle. So selecting and so discerning have they now become about their media consumption. So if we move on to the next slide, then what you can see is that despite these changes, these truisms that have certainly been the case for the last 10 years or so, there are still signs that the role of the communicator is getting more important as a result of all of this disruption, and not less important. This was the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2022, and when asked, consumers are still overwhelmingly likely to want businesses to say more, especially when you're talking about issues that matter to those consumers. We should take some reassurance, I think, that as communicators, audiences are still open to hear our messages. It's just increasingly important now that those messages are well targeted to the right groups, and well selected in order to address the most pressing interests and concerns that those audiences have. So how do we go about approaching this? Well, the next slide really covers out what we believe at Cision to be an audience-centric approach, so that we're really using data to drive both the way that you strategize about who your audiences are, how you craft the activities that you want to undertake in order to reach those groups, and ultimately, this is Cision after all, how you make sure that you measure and continually improve and use data to drive continual improvement in your approach to these audiences. And so that's what we're going to walk you through today. I'm firstly going to run you through the process where we profile audiences, understand their changing consumer habits, attitudes, and so on. And then Megan's going to walk through a couple of active examples where we talk about crafting your activities and your campaigns in order to meet those audiences, and ultimately measuring and continuing to improve as a result of good data, letting you know what your results are. So our next piece is really to cover off how can you go about sort of listening to your overall audience trends. There's a whole variety of different ways, and in many cases, perhaps more than you might appreciate. I'm going to run you through the ones that we use at Cision, but there's really a much broader variety of options out there. So firstly, of course, we have Google Trends. This is free and it's immediately accessible. It can be used really well to understand what's on the public's mind, comparing different brands, comparing key topics, or looking at particular search words over time, especially when there are major news events unfolding. It can be a really nice way, I think, of getting a proper 30,000 foot view of what are the general public are interested in, what they're thinking about, and ultimately what they're searching for. That we're increasingly using now is consumer research data. Now at Cision, we use GWI for this. There are, again, a number of different providers who offer slightly different options, but we like to use consumer research data in order to help us craft individual target demographics. So focusing down a little bit more tightly than Google Trends, for instance, and really thinking about what the interests, preferences, and media consumption habits are among specific subdivisions and groups of the overall population. We then, of course, can combine that with the information that we get and the information that Cision can offer in terms of media and journalist information in order to craft the right type of outreach. Finally, there we have social media listening, which can play a huge role in understanding specific audience groups. And in this case, really looking not just at what consumers are thinking, but also at looking how vocal are they? How are they, reaching out? How are they speaking about in public about the issues and topics and the industries that we all care about? Brandwatch's social panels really enables us to track conversations amongst target-specific audience groups, understanding more about their demographic makeup, their attitudes, and the key influencers who are increasingly prominent and important in that space. It's a combination of all these three measures that we think offers a great way to start any campaign. So let's look at how we can use them in practice. So what we're looking at here is Google Trend data, looking at online searches for a topic that I think is front of mind to many of us right now, which is the cost of living crisis. So what we can see here is the number of searches or the average index of searches over the course of the first 6 months of this year. And we're looking for two specific search terms here. Firstly, energy bills, and then also cost of living. I think this is a really interesting way of tracking how consumers first became conscious of what has sort of been a creeping rolling crisis that everybody's become more and more aware of over the first half of the year. You can see that there's an initial surge in energy bills that was driven by people's understanding of the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the insecurity of global energy supply. And that's really what sort of drove that initial interest in energy bills in February. But then generally over the course of the remainder of the first half of the year, we've had this growing trend where actually that sort of smaller individual topic has been consumed and subsumed by a much broader concern as people become increasingly aware of the impact of inflation on almost every aspect of their lives. And the impact of broader cost of living concerns has really surged as we entered through April, May, and June. So that helps using Google Trends to give us a really quick idea of some of the most, the way in which this topic has evolved and the attitudes and the sort of proportional amount of thought that it's receiving from our wider general public audience. If we move on to the next slide, then we can look at some more specific data, this time audience research data, that looks at people's general attitude towards the issue. So this is audience data, which is showing us that actually 43% of consumers say that they already have reduced or expect to reduce their spending compared to pre-pandemic. So you see a really sharp divide here, 43% reducing or expecting to reduce, and just 13% on the other end saying that they're increasing or expecting to increase their spend. So from audience data here, we get a little bit more richness. We get a little bit of an extra layer, not just that people are thinking about the cost of living crisis, but also that people are starting to act upon it in terms of their day-to-day activities and so on. This obviously is all really important context for anybody who's launching a campaign into this sort of cost of living, into this era where cost of living is so front of mind for consumers. And so this kind of audience data helps to enrich and give us a little bit more detail. We can then move on to the next slide. And actually what we're looking at here is some more specific information that's focused not just on the cost of living, but actually cost of living within the energy markets. So people talking about the key factors that help determine their choice of domestic energy supplier. And what we can see here, again, using audience data, is that there has been a significant growth in the number of customers who are saying that price is the key determining factor. Of course, energy was already a really price-dependent market. Most people choose their energy supplier based on what's cheapest. So price was already incredibly prominent here at 71.9%, but actually has continued to push up over the course of the sort of the unfolding crisis in the energy markets. And what's really helpful from this audience data is it allows us to go that step further and that step deeper. And what we can identify here is actually that amongst rural respondents, price sensitivity is much higher. So a much higher proportion of rural respondents rather than urban respondents are likely to tell us that the price is the key factor behind how they determine their domestic energy provider. Again, that makes sense. Rural dwellers are more likely to have maybe larger properties, maybe less well-insulated properties, probably harder to heat. They don't benefit from residual heat from neighbours and so on. And so actually you can see there sort of, spelled out in the data, the heightened concern for a very specific sub-audience that you might be interested in. The other metrics on this slide are showing us the other ways in which the general price increases have impacted reflections on other key factors. So actually we've seen a drop, which is maybe bucking the trend over the last couple of years. We've seen a drop in the number of people who cite the environment as an important factor in their choice of energy supplier. Obviously, price has just become more and more critical. And actually, I know from my own energy supplier, there's an increased focus on, the necessity of, that a lot of corporate communications have been going out. They've been saying, look, the priority, everybody understands the priority is for consumers to make affordable choices, even where over the last few years, there's been a push towards green tariffs. And then finally there, we have trusted brand. And that's increased by 1.7%, which again, I think is really interesting in the context of some of the collapses that we've seen in the energy markets. Folks who are getting used to the idea of being transitioned through no choice of their own to another supplier because one of the existing suppliers has collapsed. And so there's an increased sort of preference among audiences to try and make sure that they're with a brand that they trust, that they feel is reliable, and that they feel is going to be almost a long-term partner through this crisis. And that's particularly striking amongst older audiences there. You can see 55s to 64s, far more likely to say that they're concerned about using a trusted brand than the 16 to 34 audience. So that's a great idea of the type of thing that audience data is able to show us. And if we move on now to that final sort of source of great audience insight, let's have a look at some social media data. So this is all data coming from Brandwatch. And you can see here an overall trend over time, over the course of the start of this year, that's focused on the conversation around the crisis in the energy markets, and that's particularly focused on political interventions. And again, you can get some really interesting detail about the audiences here that are particularly vocal. It may be that everybody's thinking about the issue, but in some cases, what you can find on social media is the difference between people who are thinking about the issue as opposed to the audience who are being incredibly vocal about the issue on social media. In terms of tracking the interest in political intervention in the energy markets, what you have is actually a very male-dominated conversation on Twitter. So actually you can see that 66% of participants in that conversation were male. That's about 10 percentage points more than the overall Twitter average. Twitter as a platform does skew slightly male in general. But you can see that actually male users are far more likely to be very vocal about the impact and the intersection of politics and energy prices and so on, which is interesting to know in terms of, if we were reaching out to an audience that's really concerned about the cost of living and concerned about their energy bills right now. But it doesn't quite tell us the full story, because actually, if you look at the following of maybe one of the leading influencers, perhaps the sort of almost leading third-party influencer in the entire industry right now, has been Martin Lewis. It was notable that sort of before the Chancellor made his major interventions earlier in the year, about 24, 48 hours earlier, he was running through them with Martin Lewis. He's become a really, really important figure who has a real impact on the way that consumers are viewing their brands, and also the way that consumers are viewing government intervention as well. But if we actually use the social panels feature on Brandwatch to break down his audience, you can actually find that his audience over-indexes slightly on women and under-indexes slightly on men. So despite the fact that we've seen a really male-dominated conversation in terms of engagement about political affairs and the impact of politics on the energy industry, actually people who are looking for key sources of consumer advice, we have a much more broad, even split in terms of men and women. We all can also see that audience is significantly more likely, for instance, to be interested in parenting and family, far more likely to have and be interested in animals and pets too. So the social media data here can really layer on top of the traditional the audience research data and the Google Trends to enable us to build a really complex picture about what our audiences are. So if you move on to the next slide, you can see how ultimately that's how we want to fulfill that first point of our three-step approach to creating, an audience-centric and data-driven approach to engaging with your audiences. Layering all of those different factors and those different capabilities together, you can build a really great profile of what your audiences look like, understand their attitudes, habits, across both the entire population and with target audiences. And it's once you have that understanding that you can really move on to crafting great activities. And I'll hand over to Megan for that.
Thank you, Scott. So now we're going to move on to how you can craft your activities for that audience you've now profiled with specific examples. So one of the major topics as well in the press recently is, as Scott was saying, how to save money and where specifically to cut back. One of the big talking points recently has been streaming services subscriptions. So what we've done here is look again at Google Trends and those people searching to cancel Disney Plus, as opposed to those searching cancelling Netflix. We went back to November last year, and you can see the red line is Netflix and the blue line is Disney. as far back as November, you can see that people were much more likely to search for cancelling Disney Plus than cancelling for Netflix. However, as you can see, there's a big spike in April, similarly to Scott's chart on the cost of living. This also came into at the time of Netflix's results, where subscribers had gone down for the first time. And actually, as that conversation progressed in terms of Netflix subscribers, Netflix cutting down on password sharing, you can see that searches to cancel Netflix actually overtook searches to cancel Disney Plus for the first time. This is really great for Disney. Obviously, maybe last year they were always seen as kind of a secondary streaming service to the likes of Netflix. However, we've seen in the press and things that has now moved on for the first time. You can see it in the actual search data as well. But who are those people that are searching to cancel Disney Plus and cancel Netflix, and what is the audience behind that? So if we move on to the next slide. So this is where the social media, in particular the social panels on Brandwatch, that comes into it. So we looked at the people who were posting on social media about cancelling Disney Plus and cancelling Netflix as well. And we were able to look at specific demographics of these audiences based on gender, families, whether they had a family, but also the generation that they're coming to as well. So you can see the specific differences here between the two audiences. Those talking about cancelling Disney Plus were much more likely to be male, have children, and come from Generation X, while as the Netflix audience, the ones that were talking about cancelling Netflix, it really resonated more with Gen Z. And this actually tallies with some research from Kantar that came out yesterday, which showed that actually under 24s are more likely to cancel Netflix. So what we then did was look at the GWI data, which has great information on which kind of audiences are reading which publications and their media consumption habits. And we created these super target lists for cancelling Disney Plus and cancelling Netflix. So the idea is that the Gen X dads, as we're calling them, are 8 percentage points more likely to consume Sky News than the average, and 12 percentage points more likely to use LinkedIn. On the flip side, Gen Z, 28% of them read The Guardian, which over-index against the average, while they are 32 percentage points more likely to use TikTok. So for these PR teams, they know now which platforms to target and which outlets to target to hit those specific key messages. So, for example, in Netflix's camp, it will be with their new ad service, which is cheaper. But then we've also got Disney Plus that can target with their target messaging around quality and original shows to those specific titles as well. If we move on to the next part, so now we've identified your audience, you've come up with a plan of action of how to target them. How do you, as Scott said in Cision style, measure those results? So by using Cision Insights, you want to review your content, look for trends, and ultimately make actionable recommendations. So to begin with, we're going to look at this time at supermarkets. So starting with the results coverage. So Asda and M&S announced their results a couple of days between each other. For Asda, the focus was on their sales dropping, but they also tied in their coverage with their family income tracker and spending tracker, which they were saying families were limiting themselves to £30, which was in contrast to £40 just last year. While M&S's results were a bit better, they did also issue profit warnings because, as third-party analysts are saying, they were looking more at their audiences, which the cost of living hadn't directly affected yet, but it is definitely on its way. So while you've got two completely different set of results and messaging, the key topics on both were both cost of living. So looking at the wider media landscape of all the supermarkets, we looked at the total press coverage where the press were talking about value coverage, or products and things that are good value, or in other words, affordable. We tracked this for 2021, that's the grey line that you can see. The green line is the first half of 2022. You can see immediately that the volume of value or affordable coverage has really been boosted this year, just naturally. Across all brands, the volume of value coverage is up to 19% in total. You can also see, again, that big spike in April, which Scott said at the start was the biggest spike in cost of living coverage. So that's been spiked across streaming services now, but also supermarkets as well. But where the really interesting data comes in, if we're looking individually at the supermarkets and the proportion of coverage that that has a value message. So if you move on to the next slide, you can see that for the traditionally value-based supermarkets, the proportion of value coverage, while the volume's gone up, the proportion has stayed static. However, those traditional supermarkets that focus more on quality, the likes of Sainsbury's, M&S and Waitrose, has dramatically increased. From Cision research, this has definitely happened in the last few months, and it seems to be organic within the press. We move on to the next slide. Thank you. So some conclusions we can draw from what we've seen are that the press is very interested and very keen to talk about cost of living. So therefore, pushing this value messaging alongside the quality messaging in a crowded market is more key than ever. However, it's not always positive. You can see that a couple of headlines here. Some of the supermarkets' value ranges went up in price, and some were forced to do a U-turn on this. And I'm sure you all saw the shocking news last week that a certain supermarket had a tub of Flare Pack for £7. It was, I'm told, the 750 gram pot, but there you go. So what we're recommending now is that supermarkets, while they normally had their defined audiences, they're going to be attracting a different set of customers entirely. We've split this with GWI data into value customers and quality customers. So they're people that in their purchasing habits either look at value as the main driver or quality. We can see that, you know, overall, the big four supermarkets in share of voice, they still, well, the big four value supermarkets, they still have 54% of the overall share of voice, which is huge. But those smaller, more quality-led supermarkets are encroaching on that space. So we would recommend that all supermarkets widen their reach, looking at different target media sets, as we can see here. So, for example, for the value customers, 25% of these read The Sun, which is 8 percentage points higher than the average, while 80% of them use Facebook. But it's the usage of Facebook which is interesting as well. So, for example, they're 10 percentage points more likely to use Facebook stories, which would be a recommended way of reaching that audience. They're also more likely to share on social media as well. We've seen our social shares go up on Facebook, for example, for these negative kind of stories as well. So the quality, driven by quality customers, 38% read The Times, 33% the Independent, and they're also more likely to read print newspapers than average, which is still only 18% in total. So in tracking both quality and value messaging and also the reach to these target media lists, supermarkets can then report back on how they're doing. How we put this into other sectors as well, what we would say, it's just important to include benchmarks, not just for your direct competitors, but also looking at the wider media landscape, as we've done on cost of living today. I'll hand back to Scott to wrap up.
Great, thanks very much. So we've talked you through today each of these three stages, which we think are the stages to getting towards a really audience-centric approach for how you can track your audiences, profile them, and ultimately craft activities that help you to speak to the right people with the right message, before, of course, measuring those results and feeding back and sort of engaging in that process of continual improvement. So that you can continually refine and make sure that each campaign is slightly better than the last. Each campaign is slightly more targeted towards that fragmenting audience, towards that that more skeptical audience, and that you're reaching them both with the right messages, but you're also reaching them in the right channels. So we do have time now if we wish to answer any questions that anybody wants to propose. So if anybody does have any questions, you can pop those into the specific chat, and we will obviously happily talk through them. So I've got a couple of questions here. So I'll pass this over to Megan. So do we think consumers are now more concerned with price and cost of products and services as opposed to environmental factors? Do we think this is a trend that we expect to continue? And how important, I guess, is media is sort of tracking audience preferences in terms of tailoring communications around that issue?
Yeah, definitely. Well, what we can do is have a look at on GWI, for example, you can look at the change. So we do they do surveys every quarter, so it's really interesting to see the change as part of your evaluation. We could definitely have a look at that specifically. So yeah, we do have the data to go and see. I'd say yes, but I always like data points, as you could probably tell from the back end of my presentation. In terms of tailoring it for each audience, absolutely. That's so important. I think we've shown a few examples of the best way to do that today. There's two things really. You could start by looking at not knowing who your audience is and going on to see what the general conversation is and how to go about all that. But then the second thing is you might have an inkling of who your audience already is, and we can reverse that back and have a look. Absolutely.
So I think what I would probably add to that is really what we're finding with these increasingly fragmented audiences and audiences that are a lot more skeptical. And so we know that the job of communications is becoming more complex. And I think what it really demands of us is to try and make sure that we're being data driven at each point of the process. I think folks like me and folks like you have been chatting to the industry for many years about the importance of measuring the outcomes of our communications, of tracking the coverage that we're achieving, trying to learn things from it, and ultimately to engender actionable insights that help to drive better activities in the future. But I think really what this specific challenge of reaching audiences does is demand us to be data-driven throughout the whole cycle. So actually thinking ahead of a campaign that we launch and doing the right research to say, what does our industry landscape look like? Who are the key players in it at the moment? Who are the voices who are most impactful? And ultimately, who are the audiences that we want to reach? And really building a kind of data-driven plan for how we can go about reaching and accessing those audiences, which of course then you continue with the sort of more traditional measurement after the event. But it really turns into much more of a virtuous cycle where we're using data to not just assess and do a kind of post-game analysis of how effective a particular campaign has been, but actually that we're using data throughout the entire cycle to be as impactful as possible and to continually refine our activities.
We have another question.
I think that's everything in terms of the questions. We can obviously leave it open if anybody does have anything else that they want to ask, or else, of course, we're very happy to follow up a little further on down the line separately with anybody who's really interested in finding out a little bit more. But I think otherwise we will probably look at wrapping up today's session, so we can bring things to a close there. This is really an evolving and ever-changing conversation, and it's one that we'd be delighted to follow up on with you all, understanding the specific audience challenges that you're facing and working through what a truly data-driven approach to addressing them looks like. Of course, you can reach out directly to your account manager, or you can find lots of more additional resources on the Cision website, where we have articles and materials that are addressing this subject. And really, I think we have, and we've had a question about whether the webinar recording will be shared, and it certainly will be with all attendees. So you'll be able to watch through and go back through some of the details that we've provided for you, and hopefully take some inspiration, I hope, from how we can go about, pulling together all of the individual, all of the individual sources and ways that you can go about building that audience research approach and applying it to your communications.
Yeah, I think we went with lots of different options, but obviously it's tailored very specifically to each organisation. So we're happy to help there. Great.
Okay, so I think all that remains is for me to thank everybody for joining us and for your questions. I hope everybody manages to keep their cool, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.